On May 26, 2026, NASA held a press conference at their headquarters in Washington and laid out the most detailed plan to build a permanent base on the moon that any space agency has ever published. Nearly $1 billion in contracts, rovers, landers, hopping drones, and a 3-phase construction timeline. Then, on May 28, 2026, a Blue Origin New Glenn rocket exploded on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral and threw all of it into question. So what exactly did NASA announce? What actually blew up? And does any of this still happen on schedule? It was a Tuesday in late May, and the mood at NASA was the best it had been in years. Just weeks earlier, the Artemis II mission had sent 4 astronauts around the moon aboard the Orion spacecraft, the first crewed lunar flyby since Apollo 17 in 1972. The crew photographed Earth setting behind the lunar horizon and splashed down near San Diego to a hero's welcome. In March, NASA had made a bold strategic pivot, shelving the planned Lunar Gateway orbital station and redirecting its components and budget toward building infrastructure directly on the moon's surface. The logic was straightforward. Why build a rest stop in orbit when you can build the actual destination? So when NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman took the podium inside the Mary W. Jackson NASA headquarters building in Washington, surrounded by scale models of landers and rovers that looked like props from a science fiction movie, it felt like everything was finally coming together. Except these weren't props. These were the actual vehicles that NASA just spent nearly $1 billion to build, and every single one of them was supposed to land on the moon. The event was officially about something NASA is calling Moonbase. And before you imagine some kind of domed city with artificial gravity and a food court, the reality is a lot more practical. NASA's Moonbase isn't one building. It's a distributed network of infrastructure spread across hundreds of square miles near the lunar South Pole. Landers, rovers, drones, power systems, and eventually habitats, all placed strategically across the terrain based on where the sunlight falls, where the permanently shadowed craters hold water ice, and where the ground is stable enough to land on repeatedly without digging holes. Why the South Pole specifically? Because it sits on top of what might be the most valuable real estate in the solar system. Permanently shadowed craters near the pole have been accumulating water ice for billions of years. And water on the moon isn't just for drinking. You can split it into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen for rocket fuel, oxygen for breathing. A water ice deposit on the moon is basically a gas station and a life support system combined. NASA's plan breaks into 3 phases. Phase 1 runs from 2026 through 2029. That's the scouting era. Robotic landers deliver instruments, rovers prove they can navigate the terrain, and engineers on Earth learn everything they can about the conditions on the ground before sending humans. Phase 2 starts around 2029 and runs through 2032. That's when the first pressurized habitats arrive. Modules where crews of 4 could live for weeks, eventually months, doing science, testing mining technology, and maintaining the growing network of equipment. The South Pole has shadow periods that last months at a stretch, which makes solar panels useless for long periods. So NASA's plan calls for radioactive isotope power sources early on, and eventually a full nuclear fission reactor sitting on the surface of the moon. The total price tag? About $20 billion, which sounds enormous until you remember the International Space Station ran over $100 billion across its lifetime. $20 billion for a permanent outpost on another world starts to look like a bargain. NASA laid out 3 specific missions to kick things off. Moonbase 1 was the big one, Blue Origin's Blue Moon. Mark 1 lander, nicknamed Endurance after Ernest Shackleton's legendary Antarctic expedition ship. This is a towering spacecraft, taller than anything humans have ever soft landed on the moon. It runs on hydrogen fuel, which is unusual for lunar landers but gives it a massive advantage in payload capacity because hydrogen is so much lighter than traditional propellants. The BE-7 engine at its base is an expander cycle engine that Blue Origin has been developing specifically for lunar operations. It's surrounded by 4 external liquid oxygen tanks arranged around the bottom of the structure, with a large central hydrogen tank dominating the frame. Solar panels sit on top, along with a crane and davit system designed to lower cargo from the lander's roof down to the lunar surface. Endurance was supposed to launch no earlier than fall 2026 on a New Glenn rocket and land at a spot called the Shackleton Connecting Ridge. That's a strip of elevated terrain running between Shackleton Crater, the massive crater sitting right on the lunar south pole, and a neighboring crater called de Gerlache. NASA Administrator Isaacman called it the first privately funded lunar lander mission in history. The payload was intentionally minimal, a set of stereo cameras called scalps designed to study how rocket engine exhaust interacts with the lunar surface. Think of it this way. If you're planning to land dozens of vehicles in the same area over the coming decade, you need to know whether each landing is blasting moon dust onto everything nearby or digging craters that could tip over the next spacecraft. There was also a laser retroreflective array, basically a set of mirrors that let orbiting spacecraft bounce laser beams off the surface to calculate precise locations. It wasn't a dramatic payload. It was the equivalent of driving a stake into the ground with a sign that reads, "Moon base coming soon." And that was the whole point. Prove the lander works. Prove you can hit a specific spot near the South Pole. Prove the ground doesn't fall apart when a rocket engine fires into it. Then start sending the real hardware. Moonbase 2 was a different lander entirely. The Astrobotic Griffin carried a technology demonstrator rover built by a company called Astrolab. The rover, called FLIP, is essentially a smaller test version of their larger Flex crewed lunar rover, the one astronauts are supposed to actually drive around in during Artemis missions. Moonbase 3 was an Intuitive Machines Trinity lander carrying a rover built by Lunar Outpost, along with science instruments called PRISM, designed to study lunar swirls, those strange bright patches on the moon's surface where solar wind does not seem to interact with the soil the same way. Interestingly, Moonbase 3 is not even landing at the South Pole. It is going near the equator. Its connection to the moon base is that the Lunar Outpost rover on board is a test platform for the larger Pegasus rover that astronauts will eventually use. But the Moonbase missions were just one part of what NASA announced. The rover contracts might actually matter more in the long run. NASA awarded 2 separate contracts for crewed lunar terrain vehicles. Astrolab got $219 million for their CLV-1 rover. Lunar Outpost got $220 million for their Pegasus rover, a lighter version of their larger Eagle rover. NASA specifically wanted 2 different rover designs from 2 different companies, a strategy they call dissimilar redundancy. If one rover breaks down on the lunar surface, the other design still works. These aren't remote-controlled toy cars. They're vehicles that astronauts will sit in and drive across the lunar surface. They can also operate autonomously when no crew is present, recharging from solar power and surviving the brutal 2-week lunar night on their own. When astronauts finally arrive for an Artemis landing mission, the rovers will already be there waiting for them, fully charged and tested. Both companies will fly smaller tech demonstrator versions of their rovers on earlier commercial missions to prove the hardware works before NASA trusts them with astronaut lives. And both of these rovers, the full-size crewed versions, are supposed to be delivered to the South Pole by Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mark 1 lander. And here's the kicker. Blue Origin got a separate $188 million contract, with an option to extend it to nearly $470 million to deliver both rovers to the moon using additional Blue Moon Mark 1 lander flights, all launched on New Glenn. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to a lot of people, and it's arguably the wildest thing NASA announced that day. It's called Moonfall, 4 small propulsive drones developed by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, designed to be deployed from orbit by a carrier spacecraft built by Firefly Aerospace called the Elytra Dark. The $75 million mission is targeted for 2028. The carrier slows down over the lunar surface at a specific altitude, releases the 4 drones, and they independently fly down and land in different locations across the South Pole region. Once on the surface, the Moonfall drones can take off again. They hop across the terrain in short flights, covering about 30 kilometers total, gathering high-resolution imagery of spots that are too rugged or too deeply shadowed for conventional landers to photograph from above. Each drone operates for about 14 Earth days, one full lunar day, before their propellant runs dry. They're significantly larger and heavier than the Ingenuity helicopter that flew on Mars, because unlike Ingenuity, which could use the thin Martian atmosphere for lift, these drones have to carry every gram of propellant they'll ever use. There's no air on the moon to push against. And after each drone's final hop, something interesting happens. A survive-the-night payload on board keeps functioning for months, acting as a navigation beacon, a communications relay, or a terrain marker. NASA specifically described these drones as establishing a perimeter around the moon base zone, which immediately raised eyebrows because the 1967 Outer Space Treaty says no nation can claim territory on a celestial body. There's nothing illegal about setting up transponders for safety and navigation, but the optics of planting a ring of beacons around your base and calling it a perimeter got some pointed questions from journalists during the event. Some of the first questions came from Russian reporters, which probably surprised nobody. From a purely practical standpoint, you want precision landing guidance if you're dropping heavy equipment next to previously landed hardware. You want to know where the craters are, where the stable ground is, and where that nuclear reactor you're planning to install will go. Moonfall solves real engineering problems, but it also plants flags in a way that's hard to ignore. Now, all of this was the good news, the optimistic Tuesday. 2 days later, on Thursday, May 28th at approximately 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Blue Origin was conducting a routine static fire test of a New Glenn booster at Launch Complex 36 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. A static fire means you bolt the rocket to the pad, ignite all 7 BE-4 engines, run them for a few seconds to confirm they work, and shut everything down. Every rocket company does this before a launch. Something went wrong. The New Glenn rocket exploded. A massive fireball engulfed the launch pad, shook homes across Brevard County, and lit up the Florida sky orange. Video from multiple angles captured the moment and spread across social media within minutes. One frame, a 321-foot rocket standing on a pad. Next frame, nothing but fire and wreckage and a plume of smoke rising into the night. Nobody was hurt. That was the one piece of good news. Everything else was bad. The rocket was completely destroyed. The mobile gantry tower, the enormous structure that transports the rocket from its hangar to the pad and holds it upright for testing and launch, was destroyed. One of 2 lightning rod towers was gone. The concrete launch apron, the deluge system that pumps up to 1 million gallons of water for heat and acoustic suppression during launches, and the underground plumbing infrastructure all sustained damage that hadn't been fully assessed. Hazardous debris was scattered across the area. Officials warned beachgoers along the Florida coast not to touch or move any wreckage that washed ashore. And that launch pad, Launch Complex 36, was Blue Origin's only operational launch site, their only way to reach orbit. They're building a second pad at Cape Canaveral, but it won't be ready for a long time. Engineers who assessed the site told reporters the pad was practically destroyed and estimated at least 6 months before Blue Origin could return to flight. Some estimates stretch much longer, depending on damage to the underground systems. This wasn't even New Glenn's first problem. Jeff Bezos has reportedly invested over $10 billion of his own money into Blue Origin over the past 2 decades, and New Glenn was supposed to be the payoff. Not just a tourist ride to the edge of space on New Shepard, but a genuine orbital launch vehicle competing with SpaceX. The rocket debuted in January 2025 and reached orbit successfully, a legitimate milestone. But the first stage booster missed its landing on a drone ship at sea when the engines failed to reignite during descent. Blue Origin spent 10 months redesigning the recovery sequence. The second launch in November 2025 worked perfectly, booster landing and all. Then the third launch in April 2026 hit a different problem. The first stage landed beautifully, but the upper stage failed and left an AST Space Mobile Bluebird 7 satellite stranded in the wrong orbit. The FAA grounded New Glenn. Blue Origin was still working through that investigation when the explosion happened. The company had also suspended its suborbital New Shepard tourist rocket program to focus all resources on New Glenn and the Moon contracts. So after the explosion, Blue Origin was a rocket company without a functioning rocket or a functioning launch pad. And every one of NASA's plans that depended on New Glenn was suddenly floating in limbo. Jeff Bezos posted on social media hours after the blast, saying, "Very rough day, but we'll rebuild whatever needs rebuilding and get back to flying. It's worth it." The FAA confirmed it would not open a separate investigation since the static fire test fell outside its licensed activities. Blue Origin has to determine the cause themselves. The ripple effects extended well beyond NASA. Amazon, also owned by Bezos, had contracted New Glenn for 24 launches to build out its Kuiper broadband satellite constellation, Amazon's answer to SpaceX's Starlink internet service. All 24 of those missions are now frozen. AST SpaceMobile, whose satellite was already in the wrong orbit from the April failure, watched its stock plunge nearly 15% the day after the explosion. One bad night on a Florida launch pad sent financial shockwaves across the commercial space industry. So what actually got delayed? To understand the cascade, you need to know how NASA restructured Artemis earlier in 2026. In February, NASA announced that Artemis 3 would no longer be a moon landing mission. Instead, it became a test flight in low Earth orbit. Send astronauts up in Orion, dock with prototype landers from SpaceX and Blue Origin, make sure the vehicles fit together and the systems talk to each other, and come home. Think of it as a dress rehearsal in orbit before committing to the real thing. The actual crewed moon landing got pushed to Artemis 4, targeted for 2028. Blue Origin was supposed to be part of that Artemis 3 docking test in 2027 with their Blue Moon Mark II prototype. That's now a question mark. Moonbase 1, the Endurance lander mission to Shackleton Connecting Ridge this fall, is almost certainly not happening on schedule. It launches on New Glenn. No pad, no launch. The rover delivery missions that were supposed to use Blue Moon Mark I on New Glenn are also in limbo. And Blue Origin's separate $3.4 billion contract to build the crewed Blue Moon Mark II lander for Artemis 5 adds another layer of uncertainty, because how do you develop and test a crewed lander when you can't even launch your own rocket? Moonbase 2 and Moonbase 3, however, don't use Blue Origin hardware. The Astrobotic Griffin launches on a different vehicle. The Intuitive Machines Trinity launches on a SpaceX Falcon 9. Those missions should remain on track. The Moonfall drones aren't launching until 2028 on Firefly's Elytra dark carrier, so they have time. But the core of NASA's strategy, the heavy lifting that depends on Blue Origin's New Glenn, just lost its only rocket and its only launch pad in a single evening. If you're finding this deep dive useful, hit subscribe. I cover space and science stories like this every week. Enter China, because the timing of everything that just happened makes an already tense geopolitical situation dramatically worse. China's Chang'e 7 robotic mission is scheduled to launch later this year, landing near Shackleton Crater at the lunar South Pole. During that brief window of optimism around NASA's Moonbase announcement, both Chang'e 7 and Moonbase 1 were supposed to arrive in the same region within months of each other. An American lander on one side of Shackleton, a Chinese lander on the other. 2 flags, 2 programs, one stretch of lunar real estate that might hold the most valuable water ice deposits in the solar system. Now, with the explosion, that parallel timeline is gone. China's Chang'e 7 will almost certainly arrive at the South Pole first. And it's not just a symbolic visit. Chang'e 7 is designed to scout for water ice and characterize the terrain. Its follow-up mission, Chang'e 8, targeted for 2028 or 2029, will test 3D printing techniques to manufacture building materials from lunar soil. China is methodically building toward its own permanent base, called the International Lunar Research Station. And China isn't just making plans, they're executing. In February 2026, they successfully tested the Long March 10 rocket from the Wenchang Space Launch Site, the rocket that will eventually carry taikonauts to the moon, along with an uncrewed Mengzhou capsule designed for crewed lunar missions. Their Lanyue crewed lander completed propulsive landing and lunar launch simulations in Hebei province back in 2025. New launch facilities at Wenchang designed specifically for the full Long March 10 are nearly complete. These are hardware demonstrations, not presentations. China has tested the capsule, the rocket, and the lander. In the United States right now, Orion and the Space Launch System work, but neither commercial lander has reached the lunar surface yet, and one of them just lost its ride to orbit. China's broader lunar program extends well past a single visit. Chang'e 8, targeted for 2028 or 2029, will test 3D printing technology to manufacture building bricks from lunar regolith. That's construction material made from the moon itself. They're building toward a permanent facility called the International Lunar Research Station, with partnerships from Russia, Pakistan, and other nations who didn't sign onto NASA's US-led Artemis Accords. 2 competing bases, 2 competing alliances, 1 South Pole. Former NASA astronaut Thomas Jones warned that China could pull off a crewed lunar landing as early as 2028. That's the same year NASA is targeting Artemis 4 for its own first crewed landing. The first human footprints on the moon in the 21st century might genuinely come down to which program has fewer bad days over the next 24 months. And whoever gets there first doesn't just win bragging rights. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 says no nation can own a celestial body, but that treaty was written before anyone seriously planned to mine water ice, extract helium-3, or build nuclear reactors on the lunar surface. The country that establishes a working presence shapes the standards for communications, navigation, resource access, and mining rights. One expert told a Senate hearing that the nation to land first will shape the rules of engagement in space for decades to come. So where does all of this leave NASA's moon base? SpaceX is now carrying more of the load than anyone planned. Their Starship, the largest and most powerful rocket ever built, is under contract to provide the human landing system for Artemis 4. SpaceX had a successful test flight on May 22nd, just 6 days before Blue Origin's explosion. Starship is making progress. But progress and ready-to-land astronauts on the moon in 2028 are very different things. The Starship lunar lander has never flown to the moon. SpaceX's architecture requires an orbital propellant depot, a giant fuel tank parked in low Earth orbit, filled by at least 10 separate tanker launches carrying liquid methane and liquid oxygen. Only after the depot is full can the Starship lander dock with it, fuel up, and head for the moon. Each tanker launch requires its own super heavy booster. 10 launches, 10 boosters, 10 successful dockings and fuel transfers in zero gravity. That's an incredible chain of operations that has to work in sequence before a single astronaut goes anywhere near the lunar surface. SpaceX has demonstrated small-scale propellant transfer in orbit, moving fuel between test tanks. But scaling from a small demo to filling a depot with enough propellant for a round trip to the lunar surface is a completely different engineering challenge. NASA asked both SpaceX and Blue Origin last year to submit simplified lander designs that could realistically be ready by 2028. SpaceX proposed a streamlined mission plan, but orbital refueling remains the biggest unproven link in the chain. NASA's space policy expert John Logsdon summed it up plainly. NASA's moonbase plans are heavily dependent on the New Glenn booster. If it's out of service for months, either the schedule slips or NASA moves ahead relying entirely on SpaceX. Rockets explode. It's part of the process, not the end of it. SpaceX blew up multiple Falcon 9 and early Starship prototypes before they figured out propulsive landing. The Apollo program, the one everyone holds up as the gold standard, lost 3 astronauts in a launch pad fire in January 1967. Apollo 1 was devastating. NASA shut down for over a year, redesigned the capsule from scratch, and 2 years later, Neil Armstrong was standing in the Sea of Tranquility. Failure in spaceflight isn't a stop sign, it's a speed bump. Blue Origin will rebuild the pad. They'll figure out what those B-4 engines did on the night of May 28th. They'll fly again. The difference between 1967 and 2026 is that back then, nobody else was racing to the same finish line. There was no China testing its own lunar lander and capsule at the same time. There was no commercial partner ecosystem where one company's bad Thursday night could cascade through an entire government program. And there was no $20 billion base plan sitting on a shelf waiting for a delivery truck that just turned into a fireball on a Florida launch pad. But the real question isn't whether Blue Origin recovers, it's whether they recover fast enough. Because as of right now, in June 2026, the moon isn't waiting, China isn't waiting. And the clock that matters most isn't the one on the wall at Cape Canaveral. The real question isn't whether humans go back to the moon, it's which humans get there first. If you want to stay up to date on the Artemis program, the moon base, and the space race with China, hit subscribe and turn on notifications.